Hey guys, this is Tyler here. It is September 26th, and I want to talk about why I don't think MGTOWism is going to take off in the country of Ukraine. I've spoken about this in other videos and the influence it's going to play in places like Russia and Estonia, and how it's already influenced these countries, and Slovakia, of course. Ukraine is one country, along with Russia, I don't believe it will become mainstream. There's many reasons for this. One thing, initially, I will say is that Russia shares a lot of things in common with Ukraine, and culturally, there's a lot of similarities between these two countries. Ukraine obviously does have some differences, but in many respects, it's very similar. Of course, some differences is the population is quite a bit smaller, geographically not as large of a country. It tends to be more aligned with the West, and probably a little more economically impoverished than even Russia, especially if we were to look at the major cities of Ukraine compared to major cities of Russia. More smaller, minor cities would be more similar, I think, to minor cities and towns of Ukraine. The main ideal here is that MGTOWism I don't believe that a lot of the guys in Ukraine would accept as a mainstream way to live. A lot of it also, I think, is due to practicality and functionality. And like I said before, in Russia, I don't believe for the common person in their day-to-day lifestyle, it serves a lot of purpose. And it's also not necessary. One thing to understand, similar to Russia, Ukraine has a society, and their countries are almost akin to how America would have been like in the 1930s. There are respects like the 1950s of America. And if we think that long ago back in America, I mean, things were completely different at that time. And just how societies ran were different. And of course, that also entails that challenges and difficulties of these societies also are present that are not present in other Western countries. Things people have to deal with. Bad water, dirty water is very common, even in big cities in Russia and in Ukraine. This is also very common. That just having decent water from the tap isn't always there, or having warm water isn't always available. And this is just one minor example. If you were to look at a lot of the roads, like America was in the 1930s, a lot of roads in Ukraine are not really paved. They are paved, but very poorly paved. A lot of 2-lane and even 1-lane roads in the countryside in Ukraine. Many of these towns and villages, while the houses are quaint and nice, they're very old-fashioned. I mean, it's not uncommon in the countryside for people not to have things like running water or other types of like Wi-Fi or something. This is not uncommon to find in these areas of the countryside. And economics is a big factor here. You got to remember. Now, I'm not going to explain here, compare GDPs and average incomes, because everything's different from place to place. Income has different value and different weight. And I'm not the kind of person that likes to compare, because income has a different value depending on the country you live in. But what I will say is that with the incomes that Ukrainians have, for many of them, especially in the countryside, it's very tough to live. Even though a lot of them are very resourceful and they will grow their own food, they make their own belongings, it's still very challenging day-to-day life. And you also have to understand, not a lot of government subsidies here. So when people have children, when they educate them, when they have medical needs, whatever it is, most of it they have to pay. There's not, of course, all the food subsidies. That all this has to be purchased by the people themselves. So that means that like the Ukrainian women have to be very careful who they choose. Like guys that have the type of qualities that would entail their survival and their kids' survival. They can't choose poorly here. Now, of course, some do, but they often have to choose wisely. And likewise, because of how the social structures are set up, this of course extends over into work environment and professional world. There's not all the same high paying jobs, whether it's private or public sector, available for women. Many of the great economic opportunities are mostly for men. And so if a woman wants even a pretty decent standard of living in Ukraine, they're going to have to rely on a man because most of the resources are going to be going towards the guys, which means that just like historically, like in America, they're going to have to be very well mannered and bring quite a bit to the table to please a man, so that the guy wants to be in a relationship and possibly marry them. And this is just a fact. And so when you think of it like this, the whole social dynamic between these genders is completely different. As you would see in old-fashioned America or in Western Europe, the whole system and how everything operates is completely different. Men don't really have to go their own way per se. The women have to please the men. They have to showcase what they can bring to the table, because there's not a lot of economic resources just there for the taking for a woman. They have to often earn it, just like a guy would earn it. They also have to earn it, and there's not going to be as many well-to-do, wealthy guys to go around in these types of countries with high concentration of lower and lower middle class people. You just don't have a lot of even upper middle class type of guys in these places, solid upper middle class guys. So even these guys are going to be pretty well sought after by a Ukrainian woman. And this is just how these more old-fashioned societies work. For this reason, it would be very much on the fringes, MGTOWism. If it were to be accepted by anyone, it would probably be guys who were like complete losers, like guys that were living in their mom's basement and just playing on computer all day or something, which I don't even know if this would exist in Ukraine. Maybe it does, because just with how society is, most people in Ukraine have to work. They have to, unless the woman marries a well-to-do guy, everyone has to work. There's so much poverty in this country. So for a man though, it often also means that, like, if they want to have children, and most children are going to be born in marriage in Ukraine, and likewise picking a solid quality woman, of course, will mean that their children are well taken care of also from the woman's side. So on both the men and the women have to bring something to the table here. Understand also, Ukraine's a very religious country. The rate of Christianity is very high in Ukraine. I think percentage-wise it's higher than in Russia. There's a very large Christian population, and this doesn't mean that it's inherently really conservative, but when it comes to like relationships and gender norms and family life, it's very traditional in this sense. And so by and large, within the religious hierarchy of the country, traditional marriage, children, and relationships is very much pushed and endorsed. This is a really big, honestly, in Ukraine, probably even more so than in Russia. This is very much mainstream and is unquestionably takes precedence by the church hierarchy. And because the church plays such a key role in people's lives, it is very noticeable amongst relationships. The other thing also is that Ukraine, of course, is a mostly Russian-speaking country, Russian and Ukrainian-speaking country. Well, there's people that know English. English, by and large, is not mainstream, and likewise, the Western media is not as popular. There's some following, but not as popular. And for this reason, amongst others, people typically, like with any of these alternative movements, people tend to follow whatever is they can understand. If they can understand the English or German or Spanish publishing or media from this, they'll of course consume it. But if they can't even understand the language, chances are it's not really going to affect most people. And due to the fact that most people are Russian and Ukrainian speaking, maybe they know a little English, But MGTOW being a philosophy is difficult to understand in a second language. If you don't understand the language really well, you're going to have a hard time understanding what this is about. And for this, amongst other reasons, it's not really going to affect most of the masses. If there were to be a very big YouTubers who were Russian speaking in Ukraine or Ukrainian speaking, perhaps then it could become more mainstream. But at least in the next 10 or 20 years, I don't see that happening. And as I said before, that's mostly due to economic and religious reasons. In Ukraine, as I said before, most men are not pushed out of the dating market like in Western countries due to how the economics and just the gender norms of the country. Most solid quality guys have a shot with some kind of relationship. This just means that it's not really going to be relevant for most guys. They're not really going to see this as a utile philosophy for their situation. No, I'm not saying that some guys maybe it would, maybe in the future it would serve purpose, but for many guys in the present it wouldn't serve a lot of utile value. Also in Ukraine, that it's not particularly a real safe country. It's not violent, but it's not, when we look at wars there that occurred like just a few years ago, like in the Donetsk region in eastern Ukraine, and just the day-to-day in big cities, it's not dangerous, but it's not the safest. And if we looked at in eastern Ukraine, whenever you look at countries or regions, whenever they're in war, there tends to be a lot of traditional gender norms here, and there seems to actually be a high increase in birth rates in these types of countries. You see this in many countries. You would never think there's a lot, like this need for birth, so the birth rates actually go up a lot, and just for the safety and protection, many women obviously would prefer being in relationships of some kind, because if they weren't, it could be the end for them. And this is clearly seen in Ukraine. This is the first segment of this video series, and I look forward to your feedback below. Thank you.